Hello, young soul. The house where we live is small, isolated at the top of a mountain. I never cared much for the isolation, but sometimes, over time, it starts to feel suffocating. The winds that cut through the mountain make the wood creak, and the silence is thick, heavy, as if the world outside didn't exist, as if we were the last living thing in that forgotten corner. My husband, Daniel, has always liked this solitude. He never worried about the little things, like the weather or whether winter would come early. He loved being there, with no one to disturb him, without the sounds of the city, without the hurried pace that took over life anywhere closer to people. He was the kind of man who felt comfortable in silence, and I felt at peace with him. Until that moment. That night, the wind was stronger than usual. The trees swayed grotesquely, and the sky was a heavy, dark cloak without a star to light it. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when suddenly, I heard something that made me jump up. It was a distant sound, but so clear, so sharp, that I felt a chill run down my spine. A howl. But it wasn't just any howl. It wasn't one of those you hear in the forest, coming from a wolf or any wild animal. No, this howl was different. It was deep, resonant, with an intensity that made the air vibrate. It sounded like a lament, a raw and inexplicable pain that cut through the silence of the night. I froze there in bed, my hair standing on end. The sound was so strange and so human. But I knew it couldn't be. I knew wolves howl, but nothing compared to this. My thoughts began to swirl, and the logic that kept me calm in fearful situations started to dissolve. Daniel was beside me, sleeping deeply, or at least he seemed to be. The sound echoed across the mountain, and the more I listened, the more I felt that howl was getting closer. It wasn't just an expression of the wind or some lost animal in the mountains. It was something approaching, something out of place. I tried to wake Daniel, but he didn't react. The idea of getting up and going to the window felt absurd, but something inside me urged me to do it. My feet trembled as I stepped onto the cold floor and walked to the window. The sound grew louder and louder, filling me with a rising panic. When I finally looked outside, there was nothing. Just the shadows of the trees dancing in the wind. But it wasn't just that scared me. It was the feeling that someone, or something, was watching. I couldn't shake that feeling, the notion that something was out there, waiting, looking into the house. I stood there for a few more minutes, my eyes fixed on the shadows, trying to find any sign, but saw nothing. Suddenly, the sound ceased. A deep silence enveloped the environment, but a silence that felt more threatening than any noise. I didn't know what to do. I returned to bed, trying to convince my mind that it was just my imagination, an exaggerated reaction to the isolation of the mountain. But something had changed. I could no longer ignore the chill that coursed through my body. Something had begun there. Something that had no explanation. Something that felt like it had come out of a nightmare. Something that shouldn't be in my life. The next morning, everything seemed too calm. Daniel woke up as usual, with that serene smile he always had, without any memory of anything strange during the night. He seemed, until then, the same man as always. But there was something different. I couldn't explain it, but something was starting to change in him too. His eyes were restless, more intense. He got up for coffee, but something felt off. There was something in his posture that seemed a bit too stiff. But it wasn't until the following night that I noticed the first physical change. I was preparing dinner when I saw him fussing with his hair, but not in a casual way. His fingers were running through his strands in an exaggerated manner, as if he were trying to pull them. When I looked closer, I saw what was happening. His hair was thicker. His normally short hair started to look more voluminous, and a different shine seemed to emanate from him, as if he were glowing. "Daniel, what's happening?" I asked, feeling a knot in my throat. But he didn't answer me. He didn't look at me. He was staring intently at the fire in the fireplace, as if he had lost himself there, in some distant place. The air in the house felt heavier by the second. I knew something was wrong. I didn't know what, but I was sure. The howling from the night before, Daniel's change in behavior, something was taking over him. Something I couldn't understand. Something that was about to reveal itself. And I didn't know how far it would go. But I was starting to find out. The following days were a silent torture. Something was happening to Daniel, but he refused to talk about it. I noticed subtle changes, but each one filled me with a growing fear, a sensation that made me want to scream for him to wake up and tell me it was all an illusion. But he wouldn't wake up. Not anymore. At night, he drifted further away from me. I would see him sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window, as if waiting for something or someone. I couldn't understand, but the fear of speaking about it, of confronting him with what was happening, paralyzed me. Something inside me knew that if I spoke, it might be too late. But what terrified me the most wasn't just the changes in his behavior. What left me completely out of control were the physical transformations. As time passed, the hair on his body grew thicker, darker, as if his skin were being covered by a layer of something animalistic. He tried to hide, but I knew. I saw his fingers elongating as he ran them through his hair, the claws starting to emerge discreetly. On the night everything changed, I woke up from a deep nightmare, cold sweat on my skin, and heard something that made me tremble to my bones, a low sound, almost a growl. It was Daniel. But he was no longer the Daniel I knew. The sound came from the back of the house, from the hallway, where he always used to take refuge at night. I dared not get up, unsure of what to expect, but the sound grew louder. A growl, followed by a deep grunt, followed by heavy breathing, as if the very air were being torn apart. I knew, without a doubt, that he was no longer human, and I knew I was facing something I could not control. I went to the hallway door, but the silence was absolute. I was paralyzed, hesitant, with a tight throat, as if I had swallowed something too heavy. Each second felt like a century. Finally, I risked a glance outside, but what I found made no sense at all. Daniel was standing there, with his back to me, staring at the wall, his hair denser, his muscles visibly more pronounced. And his teeth, those teeth, longer, sharp as claws. I shrank back against the door, trying not to be heard, but he turned his head quickly, as if sensing my presence. His eyes were different. There was no humanity left in them. They were the eyes of a predator, eyes I could never have imagined seeing in a person I loved. They glowed in the dark, as if fed by something else, as if the being that was there had nothing to do with the man I had known. "You shouldn't have looked," he said in a hoarse voice, almost a whisper, but laden with something I didn't recognize. Something animalistic. I couldn't speak. I didn't know what to say. He was no longer my husband. I knew that, but I didn't know what to do. He took a step towards me, and I stepped back unconsciously. But he didn't come closer. He retreated to the corner of the room, crouching in a strange manner, like an animal about to pounce. And then I heard the sound. The howl. It was the same sound from the night it all began, but now it was closer. He was guiding me out of the house with that sound, as if calling to it. As if he was no longer the person who should be there, but something that belonged to me too. I knew what he wanted. He no longer wanted to be human. He wanted to go beyond, to be part of what consumed him. And I was at the center of it. I didn't know what to do, but as he began to walk towards me again, I saw the shadow of something behind him. Something more. It was his form, distorted, changing, the body twisting and expanding grotesquely, veins pulsing as if his flesh were being ripped from the inside out. And I knew, at that moment, that the man I loved had been consumed by something much worse. Something that was emerging from his body. Something that fed on flesh and soul. I ran. I ran like never before. But the footsteps behind me were no longer human. There was something much faster, heavier, almost a dragging of claws on the ground. I dared not look back, but I knew he was there, too close. The howl echoed louder, and I felt the weight of his presence surrounding me. That night, the mountain was no longer a safe place. It had become the cell of a beast, and I was the last to know it. I didn't know what to expect, but one thing was certain. I could no longer trust the man with whom I shared my life. Not anymore. He no longer existed. I needed to get out of those mountains. But deep down, I knew there might be no more place for me in this world. Something had been unleashed, and there was no turning back. I fled. I fled like a desperate person, without thinking, without rationalizing what was happening. My feet pounded the ground, my heart racing, my mind in shambles. But there was no relief. There was no refuge. The house, that shelter that once seemed safe, now felt like a nightmare made of wood and shadows. The air was thick, and I could barely breathe. I needed to get out. I knew he was behind me, not as a husband anymore, but as something that hunted its prey. I ran through the back door, not looking back, lacking the courage to take one last glance. The night was dark, darker than usual, as if the moon had been swallowed by a curtain of clouds. The wind whipped my face, but I felt no cold. I felt a burning sensation, as if something were watching me, waiting for me to make the mistake of turning around. But what terrified me the most was not the howls. It was the silence that followed them. When the creature fell silent, it felt as if the world also went quiet. The sound of the wind, the trees swaying, even the crickets had disappeared. And then, the sound I could never forget, the dragging of claws. Something was getting closer. I was in an open field, surrounded by twisted trees, as if those shadows were taking on shapes of their own. I didn't know where to run. I felt as if I were already surrounded, as if I were being watched by hundreds of invisible eyes. The cold earth beneath my feet seemed to pull me down, as if the very ground were trying to trap me. At that moment, I didn't know what to do. The voice echoing in my mind told me to stop, to give up, that there was no escape. He was going to catch me, and I knew the only reason he hadn't done so yet was that he wanted to see me. He wanted to see my agony. I wanted to see the transformation he knew was happening inside me. Yes, I knew. I didn't need confirmation. Whatever was taking hold of him had already touched me too. I could feel my skin tingling, a sensation I had never experienced before. A growing pain, as if something inside me was being forced to expand. My breathing grew heavier with every step I took. I felt the flesh of my feet tearing, but I didn't stop. Then, suddenly, I heard the sound of footsteps. Not human feet, but something much heavier. Something crawling on the ground, dragging itself as if searching for something. There were no more howls, but the sound was even more terrifying. I knew he was there. Close. The noise of claws cutting through the earth made me freeze in place. I turned my head, unable to resist. In the midst of the darkness, a figure stood out, moving towards me. He was no longer my husband, no longer the man I loved. He was a beast. His silhouette was monstrous, his body deformed by pain, by claws and teeth. But the worst, the most terrifying, was the gaze. I still recognized the eyes. Those eyes that once were mine. But now they were consumed by savagery, by hunger. He stopped a few meters away from me, and I saw the pain etched on his face. He was no longer him. He was no longer Daniel. He was a creature, a predator, something I hadn't known existed until that moment. We can't escape. His voice sounded hoarse, almost unrecognizable, but there was something in it. Something very, very distant. I could hear the struggle still existing inside him, but it was losing. He was losing the battle against what possessed him. Daniel, I whispered, but my voice faltered. I knew none of that would make a difference. He was beyond reason, and my own humanity was fading away with each passing second. He approached, claws dragging on the ground, a low growl in his throat. It wasn't just his physical form that had changed. The air around was different too. It was heavy, as if the mountain itself had turned into something evil, something that was silently watching everything, waiting for the right moment to devour all that remained. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't respond. Something was holding my legs. My heart felt like a drum, beating louder with every breath I took. I was paralyzed by fear. He lowered himself in front of me, his face so close that I could feel his warm, viscous breath. The smell was unbearable, a mix of earth and rotten flesh, a stench of death that made me want to vomit. "Do you see?" he said, his voice so low it was like a whisper in the wind. "Now we are one." Those words were the last thing he said before he lunged at me. The impact made me fall to the ground, but there was no pain. Just an unbearable pressure, as if the shadows themselves were crushing me. He pulled me close, his sharp claws digging into my flesh, but I felt no pain. I only felt the transformation. Something was infiltrating my body. Something that had already been there, waiting. I don't know how much time passed. I don't know if what happened next was real. When I woke up, I was alone, in the middle of the forest. The house, the field, everything was gone. There were no more traces of Daniel. There was nothing left. Just the night and the distant howl, far away, as if everything were just a blurred memory. But sometimes, when the wind blows, I smell it. The smell of something old and rotten, something that is no longer human. And I know I am not alone. That night has never left me. No matter how many years have passed, the cold, the pain, and the dread of remembering it still haunt me as if it happened yesterday. I should have realized. But at the time, everything seemed so normal. As if nothing bad could happen. We were young, eager to escape the boring routine of the city and explore the unknown. She was my best friend. We knew every corner of the forest, every tree, and every stone. Apparently, we were immune to any danger that nature could offer. But that night, we were naive. It all began when we decided to camp near those hills, far from any known trail, in an isolated clearing. The full moon was brighter than ever, pouring its silver light throughout the forest, as if it wanted to observe us closely. I didn't know then, but it was watching us, more than any human could imagine. Our camp was set up, and the campfire crackled softly, illuminating our faces as we laughed and talked about childhood memories. The night felt calm, like all the others we had spent together. Until suddenly silence. Not just any silence, but a kind of dense, oppressive quiet, as if the air was compressed around us, pressing down. I, with a tight chest and an uncomfortable feeling I couldn't explain, realized something was wrong. She had stepped away from the fire. Only the sounds of the woods and the rustling leaves in the breeze broke the profound silence. I leapt up and saw her, staring intently at the dense forest, as if she had heard something. But she wasn't alone. I saw her eyes shining brightly, reflecting the moonlight. She looked strange. I tried to call her, but before I could say a word, she turned quickly and vanished into the darkness. That feeling of alertness, that chill down my spine, took over me immediately. Something was wrong. I went after her, without hesitation, without thinking of the consequences. Only instinct guided me, as if a greater force had pushed me down the long path. But something inside me already knew. Something deep in my mind was telling me that this was not the right way. I walked for over an hour, calling her name, until I finally heard a scream. It wasn't a normal scream. It wasn't a scream of panic, but something more primal. It was as if she was struggling, as if she was transforming. Her voice sounded distant, yet at the same time, too close. When I finally found her, she was no longer the same person. She lay on the ground, dirty with dirt and blood, but what horrified me the most were the marks on her skin. They weren't ordinary cuts. They were like claw marks, deep and irregular, tearing the flesh in parallel and twisted lines. Her eyes were wide, and the wild gleam I had seen before was now overtaken by an indescribable fury. She was breathing heavily, but her chest didn't rise and fall like a human's. It was as if she were trapped between two realities, between the human and the non-human. When I finally got close enough, she looked at me with a vacant, almost desolate gaze. But then she spoke, in a voice that was no longer hers, with a wildness that sent a chill through my veins. I don't want to go back. The fear I felt at that moment was nameless. I wanted to scream, to run, but terror paralyzed my body. It wasn't just her gaze that was wrong. It wasn't merely the marks on her skin. It was something deeper, something impossible to describe. She was no longer there. She was no longer my friend. She had transformed into something I could not comprehend, and I was far more terrifying than any monster that could exist. I tried to touch her, to hold her hand, but she recoiled, her claws sharp as knives cutting through the air, a clear warning. What remained of her humanity was being swallowed by something ancient and dark. I knew, at that moment, that nothing would ever be the same. What she had become was not something I could save. She was beyond salvation. She was part of something greater, something terrible, something lurking in the shadows of the full moon. But it wasn't just her who had changed. When I looked back, I realized that the forest around me had also transformed. The trees seemed taller, more distant, as if they were watching. The silence had grown deeper, more unbearable. The moon, large and full, seemed closer now, as if it were watching over us. And then I understood what was really happening. It wasn't just her transformation. It was a transformation of all of us. I was about to be consumed by that evil. That's when the forest whispered to me, as if the very earth were speaking, "You too will change." And then everything went dark. I woke up the next morning with an unbearable headache, a crushing weight on my chest, and a deep sense of emptiness. I didn't know what had happened during the night, but something inside me already knew I would no longer be the same. It was as if I had been touched by something distant, something that shouldn't belong to the world of the living. Around me, the forest was strangely silent. The wind, which usually rustled the dry leaves and made the characteristic sounds of a deep forest, was absent. There was an absolute silence, as if the world had stopped, waiting to see if I would also disappear along with it. I got up with difficulty, my body sore and heavy. The campfire was just a pile of ashes, devoid of life. The smell of damp earth, of flesh, and something metallic lingered in the air, as if an animal had been sacrificed there, or something darker. But as I looked around, I realized something worse. My friend, the girl I had known since childhood, was nowhere to be found. I panicked, running through the clearing, shouting her name. But the words came out lifeless, as if their echo had been swallowed by the same darkness that now dominated the place. Fear grew inside me, like a hole widening with each passing second, until I saw her. She was at the edge of the forest, not far from where we last met. But she was no longer herself. Her body was dirty, with deep claw marks that seemed to move across her skin with even greater intensity. Her breathing was erratic, as if she were trying to control herself, trying not to let something inside her escape. I knew somehow that she had no control. Not anymore. As I approached, she slowly turned, as if forcing herself to see me. Her eyes were larger, not in a normal way, but in a distorted manner, with dilated pupils that seemed to absorb all the light around, as if she were a creature that didn't belong to this world. But the most disturbing were the words she spoke to me, in a voice that was not hers, but that of something distant, far away and deep. "They are coming." "I can't run anymore," she said, her voice echoing like a whisper from within a cave. But the sound was not that of a woman. It was that of something ancient, carrying with it an old wisdom, as if she were one of the creatures that had inhabited the forest for centuries. I could no longer breathe. With each of her words, something inside me broke, something in my mind began to twist, as if my body was no longer mine. I looked at the trees around me, and suddenly, everything felt strange. The shadows between the trees were no longer ordinary shadows. They moved. Not in a natural way, but in a disconcerting manner, as if they were alive. The pain in my head intensified with each passing second, and my vision started to blur. I didn't want to believe what was happening, but the reality around me felt like a false construct. The ground beneath my feet didn't seem solid, as if I was slowly sinking into a nightmare from which I could no longer awaken. I tried to speak, but my words wouldn't come out. I could only swallow dryly, watching my friend, or what was left of her, crumble before me. She fell to her knees, her eyes still fixed on me, but with an expression of pain, as if she were fighting against something that was consuming her from the inside out. Her body began to tremble violently, and then I heard something I shouldn't have, a low, guttural growl coming from her throat. It was as if she were transforming before me, as if something were tearing her flesh from within. She let out a scream, not a scream of despair, not a scream of pain, but a scream of a being that was being called, something pulling her beyond the limits of reality, to something that was more than just a mere animal. And it was at that moment that I understood. It wasn't just her that was being consumed. I was too. We were both trapped in something much larger, something far older than either of us could imagine. Before I could do anything, the scream fell silent. The wind began to blow again, But now I was different. The trees swayed with a supernatural intensity, and suddenly, I saw what was hiding behind them. Shadows, long and distorted figures, began to emerge from the trees, with eyes that shone like flames. They were not human. Not anymore. They were the predators, the ancient dwellers of the forest. Those entities that, somehow, had been waiting for our arrival. They were coming. When I looked at my friend, she was no longer the same. Her eyes were red, her body convulsing, as if she was struggling against something impossible to resist. And then she said, with a voice that was no longer hers, but of all of them, at once, "Now, we are all one." And then, everything went dark. As the darkness took over everything, I felt something cold spreading through my body. It wasn't just the chill of the night. It was the touch of something that should not exist. Something that came from the depths of the earth, something that seemed to swallow my soul. I no longer knew where I was or what was happening. The moonlight seemed far away, as if the sky had also closed in on the forest. The air became dense to the point of being almost impossible to breathe. My legs felt weak, as if fear had corroded my bones. There were no more sounds of animals, nothing familiar. Just that suffocating silence. And then, the wailing began. It was a mixture of voices. Many at once, as if all the souls of the forest were crying, pleading for something. The sound came from all sides. It penetrated my mind, making my heart race, blurring my vision, as if I were being crushed by an invisible weight. I wanted to run, but my body did not respond. My mind screamed, but my mouth would not move. And then I saw something that froze me in place. It was no longer my friend. It was no longer that mutilated and transformed body I had seen moments before. She stood before me, but something had infiltrated her. Her eyes had turned into two red orbs, and her body was enveloped in a dark mist, a pulsating shadow that seemed to suck in all the light around her. She looked at me, but it was not her who was looking. It was something behind her, something I could not comprehend, but that dominated me. She smiled. Not a human smile. It was a twisted, cruel smile, as if the muscles of her face were forced to move in a way they did not belong. The sound of the smile mingled with the wailing of the forest, creating a macabre symphony of pain and agony. "I am no longer who you knew, I am no longer who you loved," she said, her voice now no longer human, but a distant echo, as if it came from another place, another dimension. "I am part of them now, part of what inhabits this place. And you will be too. There is no escape." It was then that she approached. Each of her steps seemed to echo in my gut, a vibration that caused terrible pain, a feeling of absolute helplessness. She was so close that I could smell her. It was not the scent of flesh or blood, but something else. Something that made me want to vomit. The smell of something rotten, something that had been forgotten by time, decayed by its own existence. She stopped a few inches from me, and it was at that moment that I felt the true presence of what she had become. I didn't see just a person in front of me. I saw a force, an entity hiding within her, in the shadows of her eyes, in the twisting of her fingers, in the way her skin seemed to stretch and distort. She was no longer human. She was the reflection of what the forest wanted her to be. And that was much more than a mere being of flesh. She touched me, not with gentle hands, but with fingers that felt like claws piercing my flesh as if my body were made of paper. Her touch burned. The pain was not just physical. It was a psychological pain, a pain that scraped my soul, making me feel that I had made a fatal mistake by entering that place. I tried to fight, I tried to pull away, but something held me back. Something inside me, something I didn't want to admit, made me want to stay. It was as if a part of me had surrendered to fear, and the other part was giving in to the idea that there was no turning back. And then, as if fate had already been sealed, she spoke again. "You are already marked. There is no escape. The shadows will consume you. The full moon will take you completely." She moved away from me, but not in a natural way. Her movements were erratic, as if she were being pulled back by invisible forces, an internal struggle against something she couldn't control. And that's when I realized she was not alone. There was something else in motion, something that guided her, that possessed her. I heard something, a soft sound, coming from behind her. It was not a person, It was not an animal. It was a whisper, growing and intensifying until it became a low, inhuman laugh. And then I saw shadows, not figures, but shapes moving within the darkness itself. They emerged from the trees, glided along the ground, flowed like smoke, and twisted into something that could not be described in words. I felt terror seize me like a poison, something that took over every cell of my body, paralyzing me. The last thing I saw was her face, now distorted, as if on the brink of a complete transformation. She was no longer smiling. Her lips were torn, her teeth now exposed, and the look in her eyes was completely empty, as if her soul had been ripped from within her. She raised her hand, and with a slow, deliberate movement, pointed at me. And then, darkness swallowed me. The darkness that consumed me was no longer just a mere cloak of shadow. It was an abyss, deep and relentless, a vortex that devoured my soul with a force I had never imagined. I tried to scream, but I couldn't. There was no sound. There was no air. I was trapped in a place that did not exist, where time and space unraveled like mist. All I felt was her presence, my friend, or rather, what remained of her. Something much older and malevolent had taken her place. I don't know how long I spent in that void. Perhaps it was an eternity, or maybe just a second. Everything was distorted, as if the very concept of reality had been corrupted. But what I knew, what hammered incessantly in my mind, was that something was lurking. I saw flashes, not of my friend, but of figures of creatures. They were everywhere. They were not people. There was something else, something grotesque, distorted, as if they were the reflection of an endless nightmare. And at the center of it all, she, now completely different. Her body, a mass of shadows and torn flesh, seemed to merge with the other beings around her, as if she were just another piece in the macabre game of those entities. The sound of wailing echoed all around, each scream, each sigh, a mental torture, a constant reminder that my death was near. Suddenly, the scene changed. I was pulled out of that vortex of pain and nightmare. I was no longer dragged by that darkness. I was back in the forest. But it was not the same forest. The trees were no longer tall and majestic. They were twisted, with darkened trunks and branches that reached out like claws, as if they wanted to trap me there, forever. The ground was covered in dry leaves and a thick fog that obscured my vision. And then I saw. It was not my friend. It was something else. She was there, standing in the center of a circle, in front of those same distorted creatures. Her body was more deformed, more monstrous. Her skin was marked with symbols, scars that seemed to burn and pulse as if they had a life of their own. I saw her eyes. No, they were no longer human eyes. They were two black spheres, reflecting the darkness of the forest itself. And at that moment, everything made sense. She had not been transformed. She had been chosen. She turned to me, and I felt a cold shiver running down my spine. She did not smile. She did not speak. She just looked at me, and her gaze pierced me, consumed me from within. I could see she was losing her humanity, but at the same time, something inside her was still trapped, fighting to get out. But it was too late. Those creatures around her began to move, slowly, as if waiting for the right moment to act. And it was at that moment, that instant of absolute terror, that I understood what was happening. The ritual. The cycle. What occurred every time the moon reached its peak. They were waiting for me. They needed me. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was as if the very ground was holding me back, as if the forest was imprisoning me, making me part of its cursed land. I couldn't escape. Couldn't flee. She started walking toward me, her steps slow, as if she were floating, but the sound of her feet dragging on the earth cut through me like blades. I couldn't look away, and with each of her steps, I felt something inside me dying. When she got close enough to touch me, I saw everything. The forest, the shadows, the ritual. And I understood what she had wanted to tell me before, when she looked at me with those empty eyes, with that twisted smile. She was no longer living. She was part of them now, part of something much greater and older than any of us could comprehend. And she knew I would be next. The last thing I felt was the cold of her hands. They were no longer hands. They were claws. And when she touched me, indescribable pain coursed through my body, as if my insides were being ripped out one by one. And then, silence. I don't know how I was found. I don't know how much time passed. What I do know is that when they found me, there was nothing human left in me. I was no longer me. Not as I had been before. Today, every full moon night, I hear the laments of the forest. I hear the shadows whispering my name. And I know that somewhere, those creatures are waiting. Waiting for the next to be consumed. I am part of them now. After darkness swallows everything, there is something else waiting for you in the shadows. Don't let fear dissipate. I still remember that night with a disturbing clarity. It feels like the air of the entire city is still infused with that scent of wet earth and dry leaves, as if nature had hidden something there, something that was not meant to be seen. Perhaps if I had cared more about the old stories, about the warnings from the elders, I might not have gone through that. But with youth comes skepticism, the need to challenge what cannot be explained. I was heading home, alone, on a moonless night. The road connecting the city to my house is little more than a dirt path, surrounded by a dense forest of dark green, as if the vegetation were being swallowed by the darkness. At that moment, I wasn't in a hurry. The sound of the car engine broke the silence, but nothing else seemed to exist. The solitude at the wheel was comforting. It was then that I noticed something strange. A movement, a sound coming from the shadows between the trees. At first, I thought it was some animal, maybe a deer or a squirrel, but the noise was different. It was heavier, more deliberate. I stopped the car and looked out the window. The headlights cut through the darkness at distorted angles, but I couldn't see anything beyond the tall trees and the movement that now seemed to have halted. Then the eyes shone. They weren't the eyes of a common animal. I know how wolves' eyes reflect light, but these were different. They weren't just reflections. They were alive, as if they were watching, as if they were waiting for something. The glow was intense, like a flame, and it froze me in place. I stood there still, for a time that felt like an eternity, sensing that something was wrong. Something that didn't fit with what I thought I knew about the world. The sound of the wind passing through the trees was muffled, as if nature itself were holding its breath. Then, from among the shadows, the figure moved. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't an animal. It was a man. But he didn't look human. The eyes were wild, the muscles of his face, though largely obscured by darkness, appeared tense, ready to strike. His heavy breathing cut through the silence, and somehow, I knew, without understanding how, that he saw me not as a man, but as prey. Something inside me, a primal instinct, told me that I was being hunted. Fear washed over me like a wave, cold and paralyzing. And then, the beast did what a nightmare creature would do. It lunged. I didn't think. I just acted. I tore away in a desperate lurch, my trembling hands on the wheel as I tried to accelerate as fast as possible. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw only darkness, the silence reclaiming the road. But something felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, following me. I knew, with a certainty I can't explain, that man, or creature, whatever it was still watching me. Even in the darkness of the road, something told me that its eyes were fixed on me. I didn't look back again. I wouldn't dare. But fear settled in me in a way I could never shake off. To this day, while I drive, I feel a presence, a tension in the air, as if something or someone is just waiting. Me watching. I still hear, sometimes, at night, the sound of that heavy breathing. And no matter how much I try to deny it, I know that what I encountered on that road wasn't an hallucination. It wasn't a made-up story. It was real. It's a creature I saw that night. It's still out there. Somewhere. It's waiting. In the following days, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I tried to rationalize, thinking it was just a fear from the previous night. An exaggerated occurrence of my brain, perhaps. Something common, an illusion created by the darkness, by the loneliness of the road. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. Every time I drove down the road, even with the sun high in the sky, something felt wrong. The air felt denser, as if the very atmosphere was tied to an invisible pressure. And then, with every turn, I looked at the trees around me. I was searching for something, proof, anything that would tell me it wasn't real. But what I found was even more disturbing. I started to notice marks on the trees. Scratches, as if something, or someone, had deeply clawed the bark, leaving deep, almost symmetrical cuts. They weren't animal marks, nor were they scratches made by teeth or claws. They were incisions, meticulously made, as if a sharp blade had cut through the wood with precision. At first, I thought they were just damages caused by some other being. Maybe hunters, perhaps something like that. But as the weeks passed, the marks began to appear more and more, closer to the road each time. And worse, I started to notice that some of them formed patterns. Lines that crossed, shapes that seemed to want to connect. One night, after a long day at work, fatigue had already taken over me. I was back on the road, my head heavy and my eyes struggling to see, but then something made me stop. A strange feeling, like a foreboding. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't ignore it. My eyes scanned the trees, looking for those marks. And there they were, more visible than ever, appearing even fresher, as if something had planned to pass by there. That's when we came. Deep in the trees, something moved. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't any ordinary animal. It was a human silhouette. I clearly saw the outline of a man, but something was off. He didn't walk like a normal person. His movement was strange, out of sync, as he struggled against his own nature, trying to hide something he couldn't. But I saw his eyes. They shone. Those same eyes. The eyes I saw that night, the first time I met him. They were there, fixed on me, as if challenging me to look back. And I couldn't look away. I don't know what happened, but something held me, paralyzed me. The man's breath, or the creature, as I began to call it in my mind, was louder now. It wasn't the sound of a person breathing, but something deeper, more primal, as if it were emerging from the darkness to find me. I was frozen. I couldn't move a muscle. And then I heard the voice. It wasn't a human voice. It was a guttural sound, a mix of murmurs and growls. Something that pierced the silence, something that chilled the soul. He spoke, but it wasn't a word. It was just a sound, something impossible to describe. I didn't know what I did, but I knew it was a warning. And then, as if it had been an hallucination, the man disappeared. As if he had been swallowed by the trees, vanishing into the shadows without a trace. But I knew he hadn't gone away. He was there, hidden, waiting. The next day, I returned to the road once again, believing it might just be paranoia. Maybe I was starting to go insane. But as I drove, my mind kept returning to that moment, to those eyes. And that's when I saw something that made me stop the car completely. Among the trees, at the edge of the road, there was something on the ground. I got out of the car, feeling a chill spreading down my spine. As I approached, I saw it was a piece of skin. It wasn't just any piece. It was the skin of a human being, but it was deformed, stretched, as if something had been torn away, forcing the skin to stretch beyond its limits. The flesh was still fresh, but dehydrated. The smell was nauseating, like meat rotting in the sun. I knew that this couldn't have been caused by an accident or some animal. It wasn't something natural. And in that moment, an absolute sense of pleasure took hold of me. I felt a presence, an experimental thing watching my every move. The creature's eyes were closer than ever. It knew I was there, and somehow, it knew what I was thinking. I ran back to the car, locking the doors with trembling hands. I looked back, but saw nothing. Just the emptiness of the road and the muffled sounds of the forest around. But I knew it was watching me. I knew a creature was there, nearby, waiting for the right moment to reach me. I no longer knew what was real. I no longer knew who or what I could trust. But one thing I knew, I was being hunted. And it was coming. What happened after that night changed something inside me. Something I could never go back from. It was no longer just fear. There was a feeling that my reality had been corrupted, as if the world I lived in had a crack through which something terrible, something insane, could enter. That piece of skin. I couldn't forget. When I closed my eyes, it was the only thing I saw, that torn flesh still vibrating with some kind of life that shouldn't exist anymore. The foul stench of decay haunted me, guiding me wherever I went. I began to question everything, to relive every moment of that night, searching for answers to what was happening. But the more I tried to understand, the more lost I became. I didn't tell anyone. No one would believe me, would they? People talk about werewolves, about creatures of the night, but when you see one, disbelief is no longer the issue. You just want to get away, to summarize it all. Yet something inside me said that running wouldn't help. He knew I had seen him, and I knew he was still following me. I went to work in the following days, trying to maintain normalcy. But with each passing moment, things grew stranger. At night, I heard noises coming from outside my house. Sounds like running, as if someone was scraping something metallic against the walls. I hid, trembling, hoping it was just the wind. But the wind doesn't do that. The next day, my car was different. I looked at it before getting in, and that's when I noticed, on the body, right beside the driver's door, there was a mark. It was a deep line, as if a giant claw had sliced through the metal. But the strangest part wasn't the mark itself. What froze me was the shape of the mark. It was a symbol, something I couldn't identify, but it felt familiar. As if it had been drawn by something that knew exactly what it was doing. That mark reminded me of the scars on trees. The same lines, the same distortions. It couldn't be a coincidence. I figured out what was happening. I knew that a creature wouldn't leave me alone until I understood what it wanted from me. As much as I knew it was a risky decision, I chose to hit the road again. Not that I had much choice. I knew he was waiting for me, but somehow, a stronger impulse pushed me toward that path. It was as if I was being drawn in, as if the road were a trap I was already caught in. This time, I lit a flashlight. Something told me I should go to the place where I found a piece of skin, where I saw the eyes for the first time. Maybe there would be more clues, something I could understand, something that would explain it all. When I arrived, the feeling of pavement intensified. The air was thick, almost palpable. With each step I took among those trees, the silence seemed to swallow everything. The only thing I could hear was my own breathing, interrupted and muffled by the weight of tension. I reached the spot. There was no longer the piece of skin, nor any trace that I had found. But something was still there. Something I didn't see at the moment, but my body felt. The flashlight illuminated the wet earth, and on the ground, near where I knew the piece of skin had been, there was something else. A footprint. But it wasn't an ordinary footprint. It was a deep, massive impression, as if a creature much larger than any known animal had passed through there. The shape was distorted, with sharp claws that left a clear trail of flesh and bone in its wake. I was about to step back when, suddenly, the air around me seemed to change. It became warmer, denser, as if the forest itself was holding my breath. And that was when I heard the breathing. That breathing. Heavy, with a guttural sound, as if something was trying to contain itself, but at the same time approaching with an irresistible force. I looked around, searching for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it. Among the trees, at the edge of the flashlight's beam, there was a figure. It was not the same man I had seen before. It was no longer a man. I knew this with absolute certainty. Those eyes were larger now, more intense, glowing in the darkness with an indescribable fury. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the eyes. It was the smile. The creature, whatever it was smiling. Its teeth were like sharp blades, its face distorted, as if the flesh itself could no longer hide what was beneath. The skin, stretched and torn, pulsed, as if a supernatural force was in constant struggle to maintain that grotesque form. The smell, again, invaded my nose stronger than before. It was the smell of death, of rotting flesh, of something that no longer belonged to the world. I started to run. I didn't look back. I wouldn't dare. But a creature wasn't behind me. It was by my side. I could feel its presence, as if it were keeping pace with each of my steps, always one step ahead. The sound of its feet on the ground was muffled, but I knew it was close, very close. In the last moment, when my vision blurred from fear, I saw what was in front of me. A road. The headlights of a car. I was closer than I thought, but a creature was there, in the shadows, waiting. It wouldn't let me go. It was just waiting for the right moment. And I knew what it had. What it could really do. It was no longer just a hunt. It was a mark. And I was the next. The fear I felt was no longer just terror. It was the understanding that life, as I knew it, had been erased. What was around me was no longer the real world. The creature was marked, and I could no longer escape it. The feeling of being watched was no longer a supposition. It was an absolute certainty. Something primordial and inescapable, like the walls of my own body are closing in, with it giving me instructions with every breath. When I finally reached my car, my heart was racing. My vision was blurry and my hands trembled as I tried to start the engine. But the key wouldn't turn. The car showed no signs of life, as if it knew my escape was futile. When I looked in the mirrors, I saw the reflection of something in the glass. I was not alone. That grotesque smile accompanied me, illuminated by the faint light of the road lamps, with its enormous teeth and empty gaze, filled with rage and malice. It was then that I heard it. Something dragging slowly behind me through the dirt. A sound of claws digging into the ground. But it wasn't just footsteps. No. It was the sensation of something larger, something taking shape in the shadows, something moving with predatory precision. It was approaching me, and worst of all, it was already inside my head. I didn't turn around. I didn't dare. That gaze, those eyes shining in the darkness, was still with me, chasing me, consuming me. I couldn't see the monster, but I could feel every piece of it, each fragment of its presence on my skin, as if it were an extension of my own soul. It was then that I heard the breathing close, closer than I could bear. My chest opened. It was warm, as if a breath came from within me. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, it wasn't just one creature I was observing. There was more. It was an eye. Huge, monstrous, an eye that looked like it had been torn from an indescribable creature and placed right there, in front of me, within the mirror. It pulsed. It wasn't a reflection. It wasn't a distorted vision. It was real. I screamed, but there was nothing. The only thing I could hear was the laughter, not the laughter of the creature, but the laughter inside my head. The sound of 1,000 voices, all speaking at once, whispering something I couldn't understand. Something I didn't want to understand. And then I saw it. What appeared to be a human silhouette. It was behind me, but it wasn't a man. The hands were distorted. They were enormous, claws dragging against the glass, leaving blood marks, as if the car itself were being torn apart from the inside. I didn't know what to do. Escape no longer made sense. The road was a prison, the car a cage, and it was watching me, waiting, with those hungry eyes. That was the moment the car finally started, without me having done anything. The lights flickered on and the engine roared, as if everything around was breathing with an ancestral fury. I tore away forcefully, the road unfolding before me, but the feeling of being hunted, of being completely powerless in the face of that force, was stronger than ever. The creature was there, in the shadows, waiting for my next choice. She didn't chase after me, she had already infiltrated within me, inside my mind. With each passing day, I felt as if something was changing. I could feel her eyes on my skin, watching my every move. The nightmares became more frequent, and the laughter, that distant laughter I heard, was now a constant in my mind, an unbearable sound that haunted me throughout the day. And it was on that day, after weeks of psychological terror, that I realized what had truly happened. When I looked in the mirror, I no longer saw the reflection of a man. I saw something else. Something distorted, something I knew shouldn't be there. My eyes were different. They weren't my eyes. They were hers. A creature I had created. Not only marked me but transformed me. I was no longer the man who would begin this journey. What remained was merely a husk, a specter seeking its next victim. I had become what I feared. A hunter. The last reflection of what I was, now just a fragment of what she wanted me to be. And you, who are listening to this now, if you believe you are safe, you'd better look around. Because perhaps it's not you who is hearing this story. Perhaps it's her, waiting in the dark corner of your own mind, with eyes gleaming in the darkness. And then you will see. Sometimes the greatest terror is not what we see, but what silently observes us. Prepare for the unexpected. I never understood why my brother Kyle felt so drawn to the forest. It was a few hours' journey from our home, but for him, it was like a sacred place. There was a strange calmness about it, a feeling that the trees and the wind whispered secrets, and he surrendered to it with an increasingly unsettling obsession. When he decided to go hunting on that expedition, I knew something was different. It was a cloudy morning when he left. I still remember the smell of the wet earth and the humidity in the air, as if the sky itself was pressing down on the ground with an invisible weight. He took his things, his rifle, and a backpack with just the essentials. His plan was to spend 2 days in the forest and return with some wild hunting story. But he never came back. The phone rang 2 weeks later. It was the chief of one of the nearby villages, a middle-aged man with a hoarse, deep voice. He was visibly shaken. "We found Kyle," he said, the words dragging out as if he didn't know how to continue. "But he's not the Kyle you knew." That sentence, with its incomprehensible weight, lingered in my mind for days. I couldn't understand what he meant until the moment I saw him. They brought him back on a stretcher, wrapped in blankets with his eyes closed, but his body was different. He was dirty, with deep scratches all over his exposed skin, as if he had been attacked by something wild, something beyond reason. His arms were marked with claw-shaped scars, and his feet were bare, but covered with a layer of dirt and congealed blood. His beard had grown unevenly, as if he had been out there for weeks, but what troubled me the most were his eyes. When they opened, I felt a chill run through every fiber of my being. Those eyes were not his. "Kyle?" I spoke, but the voice he emitted was not his. It was hoarse, deep, with a grave tone that sounded like the wind dragging dry leaves. He looked at me, but something in his gaze was off. It wasn't the look of someone lost, but of something that had been consumed, transformed. He seemed dazed, but in his gaze there was a veiled hostility, as if I were a stranger to him. He spoke with difficulty, as if each word was being pulled out with pain. "I am no longer myself." I didn't know what to do. The shock was greater than my reason. How could my brother be there, physically intact, but completely different? How could he say those words and look at me in such an empty way? I took him home, but the silence between us was thick, heavier than any words we could have exchanged. When we arrived, I tried to talk to him, to ask what had happened, what he had seen in those lost weeks. But he avoided looking at me. There was something frightening about his behavior. He seemed hunted. That night, a howl pierced the silence. It was a deep sound, like a scream from the wind itself, yet so real, so visceral, that it sent chills down my spine. Kyle jumped up, sweating, his eyes wide as if he had seen a ghost. He rushed to the window, gripping the curtain as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the real world. "Do you hear?" he whispered, almost desperately. "Do you hear what's coming?" I looked at him, not understanding, but feeling a weight in the air, a growing pressure that shouldn't be there. The howl, it wasn't natural. It was like a scream from the unimaginable itself. "Kyle, what's happening to you?" I asked, my voice trembling. But he didn't answer. He just turned to me, his eyes now completely empty, as if a part of his soul had already been taken away. He moved away from me, heading toward the front door, and without saying another word, he was gone. I tried to follow, but the door closed behind him, and the last sound I heard was that howl again, echoing through the trees, louder, closer. Something was happening in the forest, something I couldn't comprehend. From that moment on, I knew my brother was no longer the Kyle I once knew. And now, he would be lost in the darkness of what had been awakened. The howl, it was his. and the pain of not knowing what he had become was worse than anything I could imagine. I tried to return to my routine, as if I could pretend nothing had happened, that disturbing night was merely a product of a nightmare. But with every step I took, with every passing minute, the feeling that something was wrong consumed me more and more. There was something in my house, an invisible presence, something that crawled in the shadows and drifted through the air. And it wasn't just a memory of Kyle that haunted me, it was the echo of what he had become. The night after his disappearance was even more oppressive. I stayed awake, my eyes fixed on the window, waiting for any sound, any sign. And it was exactly on the second midnight that the howls repeated. But this time, they didn't come from the forest. They came from the street, from within the village itself. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. Something had come out of the forest and was now lurking, waiting. Not just Kyle. Something much worse. The feeling was palpable, as if the air had become denser, heavier, as if something was sucking the light around. I couldn't sleep. The clock, impassive, marked the hours as the sound of the howls dragged themselves into my soul. They seemed to draw closer, the strange cries echoing across the field, as if they were hunting something, someone. I woke up in the middle of the night, for a reason I cannot explain, with an immense urgency to go to the forest. Something was calling me, as if the very earth was screaming for me, pleading for my presence. And I knew, without wanting to know, that I had to follow that call. I dressed without thinking. There was no time to hesitate. When I stepped out the front door, the air was cold. Each step I took toward the road leading to the forest felt like a step further from reality, a step deeper into the dense fog that surrounded my thoughts. The more I walked, the more I felt the forest was watching me, as if the very branches of the trees had eyes. I reached the edge of the woods. The silence was absolute. There were no more howls, not even the sound of the wind. Only the echo of my own footsteps, muffled by the wet earth. The trees stood in silence, and the darkness enveloping that place was denser than any normal night. I could sense the presence of something ancient, something that had hidden there, waiting. That's when I heard it. A low growl, coming from somewhere to my left. My mind didn't want to believe what was happening. I turned quickly, but saw nothing. The air was heavy, as if compressed, and the ground seemed to tremble slightly, as if something was moving beneath it. That's when I saw it. The figure was there, just a shadow, but it was enough to freeze me. It was crouched, its body bent in impossible ways, as if it were a shadow of nature itself. The eyes, yellow, were fixed on me. They were not human eyes. They were not the eyes of something that had ever known the light of day. Those eyes were deep, inhuman, like those of a creature forged in darkness. And when the figure rose, with a monstrous slowness, I understood what Kyle had become. He was not dead. Not anymore. He had been consumed, transformed into something only the forest understood. What stood before me was no longer my brother. His bones were broader, his muscles more defined, as if he were in a grotesque metamorphosis. His skin was covered with a layer of dark fur, and the claws on his hands extended with the sound of wear, like sharp blades scraping against rock. He didn't move immediately, as if relishing my presence. The growl, now louder, vibrated through my bones, coursing through my chest and making the blood in my veins freeze. He approached me, his bare feet treading on the earth, the sound of each step reverberating like a sinister drum. I wanted to run, but my legs were trapped, paralyzed, as if I were bound by an invisible chain. "You sought me," he said, his voice hoarse and distorted, dragging the words in an animalistic manner. "Now you will be part of me." Those words fell upon me like stones, crushing any attempt at reasoning. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, as if being strangled by his presence. My brother was not there. The thing that stood before me had no trace of humanity left. And then the howl returned, stronger, louder, coming from all directions, as if the unimaginable itself was being unleashed from the depths of the earth. The howl my mind could not comprehend, but which I knew belonged to that thing now before me. The last thing I heard before losing consciousness was a laugh. A grotesque laugh, distorted by pain and hunger. A laugh that did not belong to a human being, but to something older, something more dangerous than the very concept of life and death. And then, darkness consumed me. When I woke up, The smell was unmistakable. It was the metallic odor of fresh blood mixed with something more repulsive, something that made my stomach churn. The moonlight filtered through the trees, faintly illuminated the clearing where I was, but everything seemed blurry, as if I were trying to see through a thick fog, a veil of absolute darkness. There were no sounds, no rustle of nature around, as if the world itself had silenced to watch me. I lay on the ground, my clothes bloodied and torn, my skin marked by deep cuts, as if something had scratched me with sharp claws. My hands were dirty, and I didn't know if the blood was mine or someone else's. The sensation was of being trapped in a nightmare, with no way to escape. Each breath I took felt painful, forced, and the stench of decay intensified, penetrating my throat. I struggled to rise, my muscles heavy, as if something had tried to crush me from within. When my vision cleared a bit, it was as if the world around me was distorted. The outlines of the trees, the bushes, everything seemed wrong. Suddenly, I noticed a shape, a dark silhouette, motionless before me. And when the moonlight illuminated it more, I froze. It was Kyle. Or at least, what he had become. He was there, standing, shrouded in the shadow of the trees, his lifeless eyes fixed on me, yet at the same time, alive. His body was deformed, twisted in a way I could not comprehend. His ribs jutted out from his skin, which was stretched and tense, almost like a second layer of flesh. His arms were long, disproportionate, with claws that seemed ripped from some ancient creature, and his legs, arranged grotesquely, appeared more animal than human. The sound of his breathing resembled more the growl of a beast than the breath of a man. But the eyes, those eyes were no longer my brother's. There was no familiarity, no love, no humanity left. What was there was something that lived only to hunt, to consume. Something that desired my flesh. He took a step towards me, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Every movement he made was uncontrolled, as if every part of his body had shed any human lineage. An indescribable pain surged through me as I watched him approach, for the realization that my brother was no longer there, that he had died in that forest, was unbearable. I stood before an aberration, a victim of a curse or something even worse, a thing that should not exist. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs were stiff, paralyzed by pure, horrific fascination. But before he could take another step, the sound came. The howl. But it wasn't the lone howl of a hunting animal. No. It was a collective howl, a cacophony of animalistic voices, a wave of sounds that seemed to emerge from the very earth, from all directions around me. I was surrounded. They were coming. In a fraction of a second, Kyle transformed, contorting as if in a fit of pain, and howled along with the other creatures. I could no longer distinguish what was human from what was not, what were my brothers and what were those horrible things. There was no humanity left in any of them. The earth had claimed them. They were no longer a family, no longer a civilization. They were hunters now. The creatures began to approach, their claws striking the ground, their gaze fixed on me. I didn't know what to do. It was a feeling of pure despair. Each breath became harder, the air growing thicker, as if being sucked in by something monstrous. What lay before me was no longer the forest, it was a labyrinth of terror. I was completely trapped. And then, before I could react, one of the creatures lunged. It, or whatever it was, pounced on me with animalistic force. I couldn't see what happened next. I only remember a scream. Not mine. The scream of a soul being torn from its body. Darkness enveloped me, but not completely. I felt, somehow, the presence of those creatures around me. I knew they were near, watching, but I couldn't see. I could no longer distinguish what was real and what was fantasy. What terrified me was not just my brother's transformation, but the fact that, perhaps I too was being pulled into the same transformation. And when I thought I had escaped, they were lurking. All of them. In the void of my mind. The howls did not stop, and I never heard them from afar again. They were inside me. I don't know what happened to me after that moment. No one in the village ever saw me again. I don't know if I returned home, or as the forest finally consumed me completely. But I know one thing, the howl is still there. In the forest, waiting for anyone daring enough to seek what hides in the shadows. And I no longer know if I am here to tell this, or if I am already part of the night. The darkness was immense. I didn't know how long I had been lost in that labyrinth of trees and shadows. My vision was no longer responding. The moonlight seemed to fade, and a thick mist formed around me. The air was dense, as if the forest itself was swallowing every piece of hope. I could no longer distinguish what was real or what was a delusion of my desperate mind. The howls began again. But this time, something was wrong. It was no longer the sound of a hunt. It was no longer a symphony of creatures hungry for human flesh. It was a lament. A deep lament, as if the trees, the very ground, the earth itself was crying. A cry that seeped into my gut and left me in pieces. Something ancient, a primal pain, something that did not belong to this world, echoed through my veins. I sensed their presence before I saw them. The eyes. It was as if I felt them in every tree, in every shadow, in every breath I took. They were watching, waiting. I just didn't know what, or who exactly, they were waiting to claim. And then, when I finally looked up, I saw something that made me wish I had never been born. In the clearing before me, there they were. But they were not just the creatures I had seen before. No, these were different. Taller, hungrier, with skin tinged with something silver, as if the moon were imprinted upon their bodies, like ghosts, shadows moving against reality. Their eyes, now completely white, were fixed on me, and the stench of rotting flesh, of living death, enveloped them. They were no longer hunters. There was something beyond that, demons that fed not only on flesh but on the very soul. In the center of them, I saw a distorted figure, with a face marked by wounds and lacerations, almost unrecognizable. His gaze was still there, but there was an absence, something of a deep emptiness. My brother, or what was left of him. Kyle was no longer there. What stood before me was not human, was not my brother. It was an abomination, a creature that now existed only to be part of the scum of the forest, to become one of the shadows that feed on those who dare to enter their domain. He, or it, looked at me, and his lips moved, but the words that came out were not words. It was a howl. But it was not an ordinary howl. It was not like the others, eager and wild. This howl sounded like a cry of pain, like the agony of one who had lost all humanity. You will be the last. Its ragged voice did not sound like a human being. It was as if it was speaking from deep within a cave, distant. Something that no longer belonged to the earth. I wanted to run, but my feet were glued to the ground, as if the forest itself had latched onto me. There was no way back. I was lost. Then, with a speed I could not even follow, they advanced. They did not run. No. They moved fluidly, like shadows dancing around a flame. Before I could react, something warm closed around my neck. It was the claw of one of the creatures, crushing my skin as if it were paper. And then, in that moment of absolute terror, I realized something terrible. The eyes watching me were not just alive, they were not just hunting. They were waiting. I was the last to be collected, the last to be consumed by the night. They were not merely beings of the forest, they were part of it, and I was doomed to be just another lost soul, wandering among the trees, feeding the earth with my fear. An echo of what I once was, forever lost in the void. I am the last howl, and the forest now possesses us all. When someone hears the howl of the night, do not be fooled. They are not alone. They are waiting. And soon, someone else will be consumed, someone else will be part of them. I know this because now, I am one of them. Sometimes, true terror lies not in what hunts us, but in what transforms us. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. And if you've ever experienced something you can't explain or know of a scary story, don't hesitate to share it with us. Send your story to us via the email in the description. Who knows, your story might just appear here. See you next time. Or not, we never know what we will find.